Howdy! Today we are going to be talking about the factors influencing pay curves. That is, the factors that cause movements along versus shifts of pay curves. So let's get started. The core concept that you need to know is that changes in domestic income lead to a movement along the pay curve. So what do we mean by that? Well, first we need to understand that although the graph we have provided here labels the x-axis as GDP or Y, this Y is also equal to income, output, aggregate expenditure, and aggregate demand. And so what we want to focus on here is the fact that Y is equal to income. So as we move along this x-axis, we are actually increasing in income. And as such, we are also moving along the y-coordinates of this pay curve. To avoid confusion later on, it is important to remember that when we are talking about the slope of the pay curve, or this line right here, we are talking about the marginal propensity to consume, or the part of consumption that is dependent on income, not on the part of consumption that is autonomous, which we will discuss more in the next slide. So we will now talk about how changes in autonomous expenditure lead to a shift of the pay curve. As a reminder, autonomous expenditure is this little space right here represented by the arrow, or the value of the y-intercept of the pay curve. So we know that's autonomous expenditure, but how does this value change? How do we actually shift this curve? Well, autonomous expenditure is reliant on the non-income determinants of aggregate expenditure. And so a change in any one of these values will shift the pay curve upward if the change increases aggregate expenditure, and downward if the change decreases aggregate expenditure. So I've created a table for you here summarizing the impacts of an increase in the non-income determinants of aggregate expenditure. Remember that domestic income is a determinant as well, but its effects are limited to the slope of the pay curve itself, so we are disregarding it here. Also remember that aggregate expenditure is composed of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. All except government expenditures are affected by the determinants of aggregate expenditure. And so we are looking at how changes in those determinants change the part of consumption that is not reliant on income, investment, and net exports, and thus change autonomous expenditure. This is not to say that government expenditures aren't a part of autonomous expenditure, but rather that they are not caused by anything or affected by anything listed here. So starting with wealth, an increase in wealth will lead to an increase in consumption. So we see this causes an upward shift of the pay curve, and it gets a big green box because this change is good. We want pay curves to be higher up because even if the marginal propensity to consume doesn't change, this means greater autonomous expenditures and thus GDP, and thus a better economic environment. Similarly, an increase in expected future incomes will boost consumption, shifting the pay curve upwards, and an increase in expected profitability on the business side of things will boost investment, also shifting the pay curve upwards. And in our last green box, we see foreign incomes. If these incomes increase, net exports will also increase because businesses will be shipping more things out of the country, and this will also cause an upward shift of the pay curve. Now, let's turn our attention to these big red boxes. An increase in any of these things will cause a downward shift of the pay curve, so let's look at them in more detail. If interest rates on borrowing go up, people will be inclined to not take out loans, and so investment will decrease. If interest rates on savings go up, people will reduce their consumption as well. And so the effect is that lower interest rates, whether they are on saving or borrowing, decrease aggregate expenditure and thus cause a downward shift of the pay curve. If business taxes go up, businesses will obviously be less inclined to invest, and so aggregate expenditure will decrease, leading to a downward shift of the pay curve. If taste for foreign goods increase, then consumers will buy more goods to be imported into the country. And since net exports is equal to exports minus imports, net exports will decrease and the pay curve will shift downward. Lastly, if exchange rates increase, then the US dollar has appreciated, making domestic goods more expensive to the foreign consumer. As a result, exports will decline, and aggregate expenditure will decrease, and the pay curve will shift downward. And in this last box here, we see that trade policies has no color behind it. This is because the effect of these trade policies on aggregate expenditure depends on the policy itself in terms of how net exports are affected. So, what are our takeaways? The first is that the combination of different changes to non-income determinants of aggregate expenditure determines the position of the pay curve. The second is that the equilibrium level of aggregate expenditure, or the Keynesian equilibrium, depends on non-income determinants. And the third is that pay curves that are higher up correspond to better economic environments. Thank you.